Hi, everyone. Welcome to the All Things Amyloid podcast, where we feature patients, caregivers, and clinicians who discuss amyloidosis, a rare and incurable disease. Amyloidosis occurs when the body builds up abnormal amounts of misfolded amyloid protein, which can lead to serious and life threatening outcomes. I'm your host, Mackenzie, an amyloidosis patient and founder of Mackenzie's Mission. Our goal for this podcast is to raise awareness and share firsthand what it's like to live with this disease, to care for those affected by it, and to treat it. We hope this leads to earlier diagnosis and start of treatment, which will improve patient lives.
In today's episode, we'll be talking about genetic counseling basics. I'm happy to have with me Tiahna Moorthy, who is a certified genetic counselor at the Jacobi Medical Center in the Bronx, New York. For those who may not be aware, a genetic counselor is someone who has met the standards for professional practice and has demonstrated the ability to provide competent genetic counseling. Our discussion today is important for our listeners, specifically those with one of the 130 genetic variants of hereditary amyloidosis that has been passed down from generation to generation within their family. This will be an excellent episode to learn the basics of genetic counseling from one who knows best. Welcome, Tiahna. We're delighted to have you on the podcast today.
Thank you for having me. I'm delighted to be here.
Of course. And as we've talked about, genetic counseling is extremely important for those, particularly in our amyloidosis community, that carry one of the hereditary variants. So, hearing from an expert like you is truly valuable information. So, to start, let's talk a little bit about your background and what your training looks like to become a certified genetic counselor.
Definitely. So originally, I'm actually from Canada, BC, and then I moved to New York to complete my training and my Master's of Science in Human Genetics at Sarah Lawrence College. So that is what's required to become a genetic counselor is a master's in human genetics or genetic counseling at one of the schools that offer that program. It's a 2-year program. And in that time, you receive training in all the different specialties of genetic counseling, such as prenatal, cancer, adult, pediatrics. And there's also some niche specialties that we get experience or exposure to as well. And prior to that, I did a Bachelor of Science in biology and psychology. But the undergraduate degrees of people in genetic counseling really do vary. I think what is consistent is that we all have some kind of background or passion in science. There are some prerequisites you need to have to complete or be able to complete your Master of Science in Human Genetics. And then there's also some volunteer experience that they kind of really look for. So for me myself, I did actually work as a vocational counselor for adults with disabilities before getting into genetic counseling. That's by no means required, but that's something that I did. And then I had some volunteer experience working with other genetic counselors, but then also working at crisis lines for that psychosocial element of genetic counseling.
So you really have a significant level of training, which I think is good for our audience to know. And what would you say is the purpose or the benefit of meeting with a genetic counselor? Like, what are the kinds of things that you might discuss?
Mhm. So I think the overarching purpose is to really receive education, support, and guidance after receiving a personal diagnosis or a familial diagnosis of a genetic or potentially genetic disease. But when it comes to the benefits, I think that they're layered. So one of the main benefits that comes to mind is that you can kind of get an answer after a diagnostic odyssey. A lot of times for genetic diseases, people have been on a journey kind of trying to figure out what's going on. And I know that's the case often for amyloidosis as well. I think Mackenzie, you also fell into that category. Unfortunately, it took you a while to get your diagnosis.
Yeah, I think that's a perfect way to describe it. It really is a diagnostic odyssey, whether you have a genetic or the non-genetic form of the disease. I mean, and I'm sure it goes for tons of diseases out there, but I think that's a great way to describe, I think, a lot of the things that people struggle with.
Yeah. In addition to that, though, you can really learn the management recommendations for the condition in mind because depending on what type of condition somebody has, there's maybe different surveillance or treatment options that we really want people to be considering. And then I think another thing that's really important is learning about the recurrence risk for other family members,
Mm.
whether it be your children, siblings, even parents, because sometimes people can have genetic conditions like we were kind of talking about with a diagnostic odyssey and not know it because symptoms could vary from family member to family member. So, for example, there has been situations like in a pediatric setting where a child's diagnosed with something, and then they go and test the parents, and one of the parents has actually had it their whole lives, and they just didn't know, and it's because their symptoms were mild, and so that's sort of another thing that's a really important part of genetic counseling.
Certainly adds a level of complexity
Mhm.
to your job and discovering these diagnoses, and again, just adding to that diagnostic odyssey and the challenges that come with these diseases. But let's talk a little bit about the timing of when to meet with a genetic counselor. Does that matter?
So timing is really unique to the condition and the person. For some conditions, we want a diagnosis as early as possible. And that's why we actually have what's called newborn screening, where babies are screened for a number of different inherited conditions right when they're born that do have a set treatment, as well as it's a kind of a necessity to get that treatment started as soon as possible because the symptoms are so severe. So there
Mm.
are conditions like that, including a whole array of conditions that aren't on the newborn screen. But then there's other conditions where it would actually be better for somebody to maybe make that decision themselves, make an informed choice when they're older, and amyloidosis might fall into that category for a lot of people because the onset of the disease is closer to the third or the fourth decade of life. So we consider people to be an adult ready to make informed decisions by 18 years of age. And maybe some people, if they had a family member with a hereditary type of amyloidosis, would say, okay, as soon as I turn 18, I'm getting testing. I know that. And other people would be like, well, I don't really want to have this information for years and years before would even have symptoms. So I maybe would want to wait until my later 20s, or maybe they would potentially wait until they had symptoms. I mean, everybody is so different. But I do think that there is definitely value to getting information before you have symptoms. And so I think, like I said, it just kind of varies from person to person and whether or not starting treatment earlier is beneficial. There's some people, like parents, who would say, because I know what it's like to have this condition or for my sibling to have this condition, I'm going to test my child during pregnancy. Or even there's IVF now where you can do pre-implantation genetic testing on embryos. So there's a
Mm.
whole range of ways that you can do testing for these things. And it kind of just depends on, like I said, the person and also the ethics around it.
Yeah, clearly an incredibly nuanced decision as
Mhm.
to when to test. And when you have meetings with patients, is it typically one meeting? Are there multiple? For example, maybe one before testing and then meeting after the test results to go over those kind of things?
Yeah, so a standard genetic counseling flow would be to have a pre-test session where you talk about the testing, you kind of educate on the disease, walk people through their family history and everything. And then if they choose to do the test, then you would have a post-test session where you talk about the results.
Mm.
Now more and more though, we are seeing people who maybe they did testing themselves. There's a lot of direct to consumer options now where people can just order a test on themselves and get a result. So that's a possibility. Or there's, especially in cancer, because that's one of the specialties I work in. we're seeing oncologists or other providers order the testing, and then they refer us the patient with the results, and so then that's more of a
Mm.
results appointment. But we do always kind of have an open door policy with genetic counseling, meaning that I always give my contact information and say, you can contact me with any questions later. There's a lot that we go over. And so I don't anticipate that you won't have questions later. And that is true for the future as well as for family members. So in a pregnancy, for example, they might get pregnant again and then they might have another appointment with me for some people, I've seen them over multiple pregnancies. And for other people, it was kind of like, we did 2 sessions, they're done. I've never heard from them again.
Mm. Would you say there are limitations to genetic testing, or maybe better phrased as considerations that patients should know about in advance of doing genetic testing?
I think there definitely are limitations. The field of genetics is ever expanding, and we're learning more, honestly, every month. And so it's possible that somebody could do genetic testing and get a negative result, but it's sort of an uninformative negative because we're still not really sure why this person is having the symptoms that they have. It really does seem like they have a genetic disease. And so maybe our testing just isn't good enough to find it
Mm.
yet. And that's why there's genetic conditions as well, where if they meet the clinical criteria, if they have the symptoms, even if the genetic testing comes back negative, they're still going to have a diagnosis. It doesn't kind of take that away. But there's also the possibility that it could be an uncertain result, meaning that maybe we found a change in one of the genes and we're not sure if it's a problem or not yet. And our database for genetic testing is largely based on a European population. So we do have limitations in that regard, where unfortunately, still people of color might be more likely to end up with an uncertain result than somebody of European ancestry. And so in those cases, they really need to monitor, the labs need to monitor those results over time. And then once they get more information, they let us know and the patient know.
Mhm.
But also we can get unexpected results. So if we do a really large genetic test and we're kind of expecting to get answers about these specific symptoms, maybe we end up getting an answer about something completely different we weren't even thinking about. Maybe we find a change in a cancer protecting gene and we weren't even thinking about cancer. And so
Mhm.
sometimes that happens too. Um, and then there's also the psychosocial considerations. People have different needs when it comes to getting results. Some people feel like knowledge is power, and other people feel like this just really stresses me out. And now I have this information and I don't really know how to deal with it. And
Yeah.
yeah, I would say lastly, there's the Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act that it protects people from their medical insurance companies and their employers from discriminating against them if they were to have a positive result, for example. But it doesn't protect people from their life insurance companies changing their
Mm.
rates based on the result that they have, meaning that life insurance could ask somebody if they've had genetic testing and maybe increase the rates that they offer somebody based on somebody having a positive result. So there is a lot of considerations, but these are also all things we definitely go over in the appointment.
Of course. And let's talk a little bit about the potential consequences for the other members of the family.
Yeah, so I think, like I was kind of mentioning, and I know that you know this as well, that there are types of amyloidosis that are hereditary. One of the most common ones being the type of amyloidosis that's caused by the TTR gene. And with that specific type of amyloidosis, we know that people's family members are at a 50% chance to inherit the same condition. So, any children that that person has, siblings could also be at risk, and parents. Occasionally, we do see it where it's kind of de novo, meaning new in the family. There's nobody else at risk, and this is a first person, and therefore we don't expect siblings or other family members to be impacted. But even in those situations, to know that it's new in a family member, the only way to kind of learn that is for other family members to get tested and see if they
Mhm.
affect it or not.
So, question on that: if you have a patient who has like the de novo, I don't
Mhm.
think form is the right word, but it's a new mutation within their family. Would
Mhm.
you expect, are there like you said, the siblings and their parents may not necessarily be at risk, but are their children going to be at risk?
Yes. So typically, even if it's new in a family member, if the change happened at the time where the egg and the sperm meet, then their children will be at the 50% risk. So it would have that risk in future generations. It's just that siblings and parents wouldn't necessarily be at risk. So if parents are kind of like, my child has this hereditary type of amyloidosis, I want to know the chance of us having another child with the condition. If it's hereditary, then the risk is 50%. If it's
Mhm.
new in that child, then the risk is less than 1%. So that's kind of where the benefit of doing what we call cascade testing, or familial variant testing comes in, where we offer testing to other family members.
Yeah, that's good to know. It's very interesting
Mhm.
how these diseases are passed on.
Yeah, it's definitely interesting, and we're always learning more too.
Yeah, which is great. I mean, that's exciting, and it just means better outcomes, better chances for patients.
Mhm.
So, Tiana, I want to thank you so much for sharing your time today and all these insights into genetic testing. And I know that it will be extraordinarily helpful for our amyloidosis community.
Of course, I'm really happy that you had me here, and it was definitely a pleasure to be able to participate and be a part of something that's so meaningful.
Absolutely. So, in summary, just want to give you the opportunity to offer up any message you have for patients who maybe haven't undergone genetic testing yet, but is something that they're considering.
I think that don't be shy to reach out to your genetic counselors. There are so many of us, and we are honestly always happy to help. And just remember that choosing to meet with a genetic counselor doesn't mean that you have to get genetic testing. We will walk you through your options and definitely empower you to make the best decision for you. And if you are, after this, kind of like, I want to meet with a genetic counselor, there is a website you can go to, www.findageneticcounselor.com. It's on the National Society of Genetic Counselors website, and you can find, yeah, genetic counselors for really any specialty. I did forget to mention earlier, but for amyloidosis specifically, most people would be seen in an adult or pediatric setting. So just keep that in mind if you're somebody listening with or possibly thinking you might have amyloidosis, that that's kind of where you would probably want to start.
Well, thank you so much. I know today's discussion about genetic testing is, again, so important for those that are affected by hereditary amyloidosis. So, helping us to understand the purpose and the timing of testing and what the interaction with genetic counselors looks like can really help patients navigate their journey and truly impact their broader family.
Absolutely. And I hope that if anybody has questions, that don't hesitate to reach out, but definitely it was wonderful being here.
Absolutely. Thanks so much.
Of course.
Thank you for listening to the All Things Amyloid podcast. If you find our podcast informative, please follow and share it with others. If you want to learn more about the work we're doing at Mackenzie's Mission, please visit mm713.org. We'd also like to thank AstraZeneca Pharmaceuticals, Alexion Pharmaceuticals, Alnylam Pharmaceuticals, and Bridge Biopharma for their sponsorship to help raise awareness about amyloidosis. We hope you stay tuned for future episode drops. Thanks for listening.